Working in a hospital where there's near perfect understanding and commitment to the absolutely unified mission and clinical priorities of caring for combat wounded patients was the most striking thing. The joy of working in a place where everyone is helping you try to get to yes really imprints on you in a way that you carry back to your civilian role.
The new provider downrange needs to really mentally prepare themselves for this experience. It's difficult, but in the end, it's the most rewarding thing you will ever do.
Enter the world of military trauma surgery with Frontline Surgery, where we bring you expert insights and real-world scenarios to help surgeons stay ready.
Brought to you by the AAST Military Committee. Join us as we engage in conversations with field experts, examine critical battlefield scenarios, and uncover the strategies that keep surgeons ready for anything.
Stay prepared and stay sharp with Frontline Surgery, where every episode provides key insights into mastering military trauma care.
Welcome to Frontline Surgery, where we focus on preparing surgeons to master military trauma care. I am Rachel Russo, your host for today's episode, joined by co-host Matt Martin. Say hi, Matt.
Hello.
Today, we are thrilled to have with us Colonel Retired Brian Eastridge and Colonel Retired Rachel Hight with us to discuss life and surgery at a Role 3 military treatment facility, preparing for the next war.
All right. And Colonel Eastridge usually needs no introduction. He's a nationally recognized trauma surgeon, retired U.S. military officer in the U.S. Army. He served as director of the Joint Theater Trauma System and trauma consultant to the U.S. Army Surgeon General. He has certainly been instrumental in transforming battlefield trauma care and advancing military trauma system development. And Brian, real quick, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your Role 3 deployment experience?
Yeah, so I spent 31 years in the Army as a medical service corps officer, and then transitioned to a medical corps officer when I finished medical school. Deployed multiple times as a reservist, and then went on to active duty in 2004. So I had the opportunity to ultimately do 6 deployments to theater. Several of those were served at Role 3 MTFs. In addition to that, I was the first JTTS director and also served as JTTS director, Joint Theater Trauma System director 2 more times. And in that role, I actually had the opportunity to circulate around the battlefield and actually engaged at multiple Role 3 military treatment facilities.
Thank you very much, Brian. Colonel Hight is the former squadron commander for the 60th Surgical Squadron at Travis Air Force Base and served as a trauma czar at the Role 3 MTF at the Craig Joint Theater Hospital in Afghanistan during the peak of combat. She now serves as the military civil liaison at UC Davis, which bridges operational readiness with high acuity civilian trauma training. Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your experience in Role 3 and in your new role with military-civilian partnerships?
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. I had a career that was 29 years in the Air Force, and I only deployed twice. I went both times to Bagram, the first time in 2010, right after the troop surge, and that I was a trauma czar at that deployment. The second time, I was the Surgical Services Flight Commander, but it was, I think, a unique opportunity that the JTS asked me to kind of go as a mentor for the trauma surgeon that was a junior surgeon for his first deployment. So I got to have that additional capacity during that deployment. After that, I finished out my military career. I had been an embedded surgeon at UC Davis. I transitioned to a civilian role where I'm the military-civilian partnership liaison. We have a unique training platform for trauma and combat readiness skills that spans not only physicians, but nurses, technicians, and respiratory therapists. So it's pretty exciting. Thank you.
All right, great. We're glad to have both of you. And so today we're going to specifically explore life and surgery at a Role 3 medical treatment facility setting. Things like what you wish you knew before you deployed, what might change for those preparing to deploy in the future. And even within the Role 3, there are multiple different Role 3 configurations you might be deployed with.
Yeah, to frame the rest of our talk, I'd like you guys to envision a scenario. Imagine that you're advising a young surgeon who is fresh out of training and they're preparing for their first deployment to a Role 3 MTF. And they're coming into a very intense period of combat and they have lots of questions for you. First, Colonel Eastridge, what is a Role 3 MTF and how is it different from Role 1 and 2?
Yeah, so the Role 3 is basically your highest level of care within the area of operations. And functionally, the Role 3 really serves as sort of a terminal point of damage control resuscitation and surgery for the theater. It's more robustly resourced than the Role 1 and the Role 2. There's a definitive need for general and trauma surgeons at the Role 3. Some of the other needed surgical services at many of the Role 3s will be your orthopedic service and neurosurgery. As you have more, depending on the operational environment, if you have more fully developed area of operations, you may actually have the ability to work with thoracic surgeons, urologic surgeons, maxillofacial surgeons. Oftentimes, due to the resource constraints, time and operating rooms, you may find yourself operating with multiple services operating at the same time. These level 3s or Role 3s will also have robustly staffed intensive care units, advanced diagnostics, and ultimately, depending on where your Role 3 is, if you're at an aeromedical evacuation hub, you'll have the need to be able to coordinate medical evacuation.
All right, great. So Colonel Hight, how might surgery at a Role 3 MTF differ from surgery at your busy civilian trauma center?
Obviously, there's the aspect of being in an active combat zone and all the nuances that come along with that, like carrying your weapon, wearing various amounts of your battle rattle, depending on the mission requirements, which are always quite dynamic, and then the constant vigilance and awareness of all your surroundings and that same vigilance about your resources and continual planning for unexpected things. From a clinical perspective, I would say that working in a hospital where there's what felt like to me a near perfect understanding and commitment to the absolutely unified mission and clinical priorities of caring for combat wounded patients was the most striking thing. My deployments were the only times in my career that I have felt that same purity of focus, where I felt that the entire hospital was 100% laser focused on care of surgical patients. We did care for non surgical patients, of course, as well as all the surgical and combat wounded, but the joy of working in a place where everyone is helping you try to get to yes really imprints on you in a way that you carry back to your civilian role.
What are some of the things that you might be missing at a deployed Role 3 that we get used to and rely on at our level 1 trauma centers?
Oh, that's a tough one. Honestly, I don't know. I felt like I had everything I needed and more. I loved being in a place where I didn't have to hunt down specialists that wanted to participate. When a trauma activation went off, the general census was resources and personnel pushed to the bay to help support things. The OR nurses were very proactive. I didn't have to find anesthesia to talk about a case. So honestly, I felt really quite spoiled in the Role 3 opportunity because everyone was really unified on just getting the work done, finding out what needed to be done, and making it happen. Neurosurgeons coming and meeting me in the CAT scan just independently because they wanted to see what they were going to be up against. The opposite of trying to convince somebody that they need to come see your patient and participate in work for them.
Brian, you had something to add?
No, I was going to say, that Role 3 environment, I think they're a little bit different in that, in the deployed environment, your Role 3 really is going to be prioritizing speed, survival, expeditious surgery, and throughput. In the civilian environment, obviously, particularly at the higher tier trauma centers, the emphasis is going to be on comprehensive care and, even rehabilitation and reintegration. I think to answer your other question about, the differences between the civilian and the deployed Role 3 environment, I agree with Dr. Hight that, is there with a singular purpose. I think that the real difference is a little bit on the side of safety and security, right? You always have to have that protective posture. You're always potentially at risk for indirect fires, or even terroristic or threats or attacks on your forward operating base. So I think that would be the main thing that I saw as a difference in working at a Role 3 versus here at my trauma center.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, at most Role 3s, you probably won't have interventional radiology. We rely on them a lot in the civilian environment. You may or may not have a CAT scan. So there are some limitations, but I agree with you both. I rarely found that I missed not having those.
Well, I think that's very encouraging to hear all of the people who come together at the Role 3 in order to help make sure that the patients get the very best care. I can only imagine coming straight out of training and deploying to be in charge at a new location in a combat zone. What it surprised you guys when you were put in that situation yourselves? Did you find that anything about your early deployments that was different than what you were expecting?
I was incredibly lucky. I was deployed to Bagram when it was more mature. We did have surgical specialists there, and everyone had a chance to really fully utilize their skills. And everyone was really just ready to help, even if it was beyond what they normally did or practice things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. Things like an orthopedic hand surgeon on my team helping with a re-exploration of an abdomen until I could get myself or another general surgeon free from a bigger disaster to help run that case. I was also just really honestly impressed at how advanced our medical capability was in theater at that time. For example, we had capability to run our own ICU dialysis using the next stage renal machine. We did have a nephrologist at that time deployed with us, but we also had very close communications with Ray Fang and his team at Launchstool. The other thing I was really impressed about and surprised about in a good way was just really how rapidly the walking blood bank could be activated. And then just seeing the effect of whole blood capability to stabilize patients who had 60 to 100 units of product throughout their care, and just seeing that immediate effect and stabilization. You read about it, you hear about it in the CPGs, you hear other surgeons talk about it, but really seeing it in action is just astounding.
How about you, Brian?
Yeah, I think, there was a couple of things that surprised me. My early deployments were in 2, 3, and 4. A couple of those were to roll 2s. And I think, what surprised me was, the degree of, I'm going to use brotherhood as a colloquialism. I mean, that we are all working together to make sure that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines can make it home and have the best chance at functional survival. The thing that concerned me and was a real surprise to me, particularly on my first 2 deployments, was the lack of readiness for the mission by some of the deployed surgeons. There were many surgeons that at the time when I deployed, I already trained and had several years of practice as a trauma surgeon. But many of the surgeons that came out to join my team were not well trained. They were surgical oncologists. They had sort of general surgery practices, and really had not trained themselves up to the requirements of the mission, particularly with respect to the need to be adept at damage control, resuscitation, and surgery.
I think that leads us into the next question. What were the most common mistakes that you saw from new surgeons, whether they were trauma surgeons or other specialty surgeons, and how might those be avoided in the future?
I think that the main key mistake that younger, inexperienced surgeons make, and actually, frankly, experienced surgeons, I've made this mistake myself, is doing too much surgery and sort of over operating on patients. So not really sticking to the damage control philosophy. I think that's the main mistake. I think some of the other mistakes are, if you're not in this realm, I think you have the potential to make poor triage decisions, not understanding your environment and understanding the relationship of medical care to the mission. And I think one of the main, sort of from a personal character type of issues, is the surgeon should be a leader. And so that failure to lead, I think, was a real problem, particularly early on in the deployments.
Rachel, I see you're nodding along to everything. And as someone with experience mentoring and training, why don't you pick up where Brian left off?
Yeah, I agree with Brian 100%. I think the biggest mistake is trying to treat patients like you do in civilian centers. The resource allocation is just really different in a combat zone compared to a civilian center. And just like Brian said, the focus is a little bit different on the throughput and that capacity and preserving that to the best of your ability. I think we also in combat built our systems to really anticipate that lowest common denominator of performance so far as skills or resources, not because people aren't good or excellent, but you never know what the conditions are like at other theater locations. So you kind of have to operate from a position of assuming the worst, if that makes sense. The old mantra of trust but verify does have a real significance in combat care. In theater, what we really focused on was trying to eliminate any need for future rescue at other echelons beyond us, because we didn't want a patient to destabilize, especially with us being a theater hub at Bagram, where we knew we really had to get the patients ready for that out of theater transport. And we had to scrutinize the work that was done on prior echelons of care, because that the conditions and circumstances might not have been ideal, even if the surgeons were excellent. In the civilian setting, you might not have to be as aggressive about those operations and things, because you do have that capacity and that luxury of time and resources to maybe rescue in a different way than you do in theater. Because of that, sometimes I think it was a little hard as a trauma czar, kind of working on that kind of theater care delivery. Because sometimes the downrange providers wanted to do that definitive work, and it could be a point of contention if they felt we didn't trust them. So those situations you had to manage, with a lot of humility and a genuine patient-centered focus. At Bagram, on the flip side of that, sometimes it was hard to have everyone on board with reopening a closed abdomen or doing an additional washout that looked fine or just was washed out yesterday, because we had a responsibility for that throughput to make sure that patients would be fully optimized and ready to hit the planes when that out of theater transport was available. And that was just unpredictable, as you might expect in a combat theater. So, kind of on both sides of things, just kind of getting people to be in that mindset of optimize, do it ASAP, and be thorough and focus on throughput.
And so, Rachel, you have a new surgeon who's arrived at their role 3. What are the top 2 or 3 things you tell them should be their first priorities when they arrive?
That's an excellent question. I think aside from all the preparedness that you try to do to be ready before you hit the ground, I would say meeting your team and your leadership and getting critical communication and resource information right away. Hopefully, the military tradition of having that sponsor to help you in those first day or two in theater would still persist in a future Role 3 setting, because hopefully you'll be getting a warm handoff from somebody on the team that you're replacing, ideally like your own counterpart. I would recommend that, just making that connection immediately, getting those critical information bits. Find out where everything is in your facility, and figure out day one, as soon as you've like kind of dropped your gear in your room or wherever you're at, figure out what it takes to get a patient through initial arrival, triage to the OR and out. Like just having a basic understanding of what critical things you need to know and who you need to know to make that happen is key, because the first mass cow might happen 10 minutes after you get there. So you just got to hit the ground running. And then I would say, get a message out to your loved ones that you made it to theater safely, and try to set expectations early with them about how and when you hope you can communicate.
How about you, Brian? Any additional advice for that new person?
No, I am 100% on board with, what Dr. Hight said about, once you get there, you need to orient yourself to the facility, the command, how they do things with respect to patient care and evacuation. Hopefully, with, 20 years of working to develop a system, our processes and flow should be sort of minimal variation, but at least understand how the facility is doing things, understand the role of the trauma team and how that trauma team works with, again, the command chain, how it works. Are there interoperability? Is the interoperability with the joint or combined forces? How does that work in the theater? And then lastly, something on a personal note is I think that the new provider downrange needs to really mentally prepare themselves for this experience. It's like nothing that you've ever done before. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's gut wrenching, but in the end, it's the most rewarding thing you will ever do. But I think you really need to mentally prepare yourself for that.
Yeah, and I'll add one other thing I tell all my juniors is go to your OR supply room or cabinet and walk through it and see
Yeah.
exactly what you have and what you do not have.
Yes.
And you'll be shocked at some of the things you have, and you'll be shocked at some of the things you don't have.
Yeah, you'll be 100 miles from anywhere and you'll have endovascular stents.
Yeah. I found a radio frequency ablation machine in but I didn't have a JP drain.
Must have used them all. Both of you hit on the importance of considering patient throughput and patient movement as you're allocating resources and deciding what to do surgically. So, Colonel Eastridge, why don't you start? Can you tell us about the importance of the joint theater trauma system and how that shaped delivery of combat casualty care?
Yeah, so the joint theater trauma system is really the deployed arm of the joint trauma system. So historically, actually, the JTTS actually came first, and that was placed in 2004, really secondary to a realization by several of the consultants to the Surgeons General that there were significant issues with patient care, variability in care, communication, documentation, really that was rampant across the theater. So in very short order, the higher echelons of command were very interested in, putting a systematic process on the battlefield to ensure optimization of care. So what that, over the period of time that the JTTS and the JTS have developed in the last 20 25 years, it's really developed systematization of combat casualty care from point of injury through care applied on the battlefield, as well as back in CONUS. It's also been very valuable at establishing real-time coordination and to some degree situational awareness of the sort of the medical aspects of the battlefield. By far, I think the most important thing that the traumas the JTS and JTTS have done for combat casualty care is really in driving medical performance on the battlefield with evidence. Again, by having the capability to have a fairly robust registry. The JTS was able to develop clinical practice guidelines, again, to minimize that practice variation and find opportunities for improvement, which we have continuously done, since the inception of the system in 2004.
All right, Rachel. So you deployed as a trauma czar with a large team, bunch of surgeons, many of whom were not trauma surgeons. So what are your tips for managing these surgical teams that, one, haven't worked together, and a lot of them don't routinely do trauma surgery, but now they have to take care of some of the most complex trauma patients in the world?
That's a great question. I think the key thing that I would recommend to somebody in that situation is finding mentors. The mentors were key to helping me just have a framework and ideas about how to approach it. But then in theater on, boots on ground, I did operate from a belief that everyone really wanted to do their best and was trying really hard to provide excellent care for our nation's heroes and everyone else that we were working on. So it kind of fell quickly into a framework of education and training and feedback. And that personally kind of fits my personality and leadership style. Like, I was really lucky. Jay Johanneman was the DCCS when I deployed the first time to Bagram. He was a seasoned combat surgeon. He saw at first that I was trying to do everything that I thought a leader was supposed to do. I kind of had this mental expectation that I needed to be everywhere, doing everything, scrubbing every single case, and kind of like being intimately involved in everything. And he quickly recognized that I was going to burn myself out if I didn't throttle back and figure out a better way to pace myself. The other thing that he did that was really helpful to me as a new leader was advising me that I needed to get out of the way of all these other surgeons. Like, they showed up, they raised their hand, they were there, they were participating, and they wanted to contribute. And even if they didn't do trauma surgery for a living, they were capable of it. And him just kind of reminding me of that people wanted to contribute and were there for a reason was excellent. And so I kind of focused on really supporting and coaching and participating on the higher level, more complicated cases, but really trying to let people really grow into their role and expand their own scope of practice and their own confidence. And that was really amazing because at the end of it all, I think everyone contributed heavily and they had that personal sense of accomplishment and pride in that experience. And that shared feeling of success was really important for me to see how the fact that I hadn't overshadowed them really led to them being able to grow into that role and that capability.
Being a female surgical leader in a combat zone, do you feel like that gave you any advantages, or did it pose any challenges whenever it came time for you to exert all those leadership characteristics?
I don't think so. I was really lucky. I had a great commander and I had a great team. I think they appreciated that I was willing to support them and keep everyone just focused on the mission. So I didn't feel like I really had any challenges. I was surprised. I will share that I had a significant advantage in some ways. I went over to Afghanistan thinking that because it was much more of a patriarchal society that might be a problem, but I was very impressed and humbled to see just how much deference I received as the female leader of everything clinically happening, that the Afghan men and women really looked to me in that leadership role. And then just from a clinical experience, being a female provider opened up a whole new realm of opportunities to treat Afghan women that maybe other providers didn't get. So I felt very blessed to have that kind of unique perspective.
Looking forward now, obviously, the big topic of discussion now is what we're going to see in the next wars. How do you both think our future Role 3 operations are going to evolve, especially in large-scale conflicts against peer or near-peer adversaries? Why don't we start with you, Brian?
Yeah, so that's a really daunting prospect. Certainly, the operational environment is going to be different than the operational environment we've faced in the last 20 years. It's going to be multi-domain. So again, we're primarily fighting a ground war. We will definitely be in the air, be at sea. We'll have to contend with cyber threats as well as potentially even space. We can expect that a lot of the things that we got used to, including decent communications and supply, are not going to be there because of contested air and sea space. The Role 3 itself is really these bulky, immobile facilities is probably going to would be a thing of the past in the LSCO contingency. I think just because of the threat of the armament that our near peer adversary would have. as well as the prospect of drone attack. Role 3s are going to have to be more modular, potentially and more mobile, potentially even hardened or underground. I think there's going to be limitations of resources and likely limitations of personnel because there's just not going to be enough surgeons and surgical teams. There's going to be a great need for cross-training and maybe upscaling some folks to do jobs that they're not really used to doing to participate in the combat casualty care. The casualty flow, we're expecting massive casualty flows to the degree that none of us have seen before, even in major mass casualty events that we've seen in the U.S. and the like. So we need to know how to do triage and do triage well. And I think those are the big things that I see as problems. And that's in the scope of a war that takes place somewhere else. We also have to think of, this war could occur at home, and that would, bring an even more challenging perspective, to using these role 3s.
All right. And Rachel, what do you think?
I agree with everything that Brian was saying. One of the things that's unique about the experience I had in Bagram was even though we were in theater, I didn't feel isolated. And I do worry that with contested airspace and with the future conflicts, that even in a role 3, the teams there may feel very isolated and may have threats that we didn't experience in a different way with, cybersecurity and things like that. I do worry about the reliance on a lot of the communications and mechanisms of just reaching back and getting the CPGs. I carried paper copies of things because I didn't know what we had in theater. And I think right now we're very reliant on electronic communications and resources that may not be fully available. I do think also, as Brian pointed out, that just volume of casualties might be considerably overwhelming in that contested future conflict. So I think the capacity and overflow could lead to having more experiences of death. That's going to take a psychological and human toll that will be even much more greatly magnified than what we experienced in Bagram. We were lucky to have such high survival rates for everyone that hit our door alive. I don't know that that would still be the case in a future conflict with overwhelming numbers of casualties, limited resources to get people out, and then that isolation that you might experience from that lack of throughput and that lack of aerospace dominance that we might face.
The whole concept of that prolonged field care spectrum with no ability or limited ability to evacuate is going to have to align our thinking and sort of downregulate our expectations. As Dr. Hight said, toward the end of the conflict, if your casualty made it to the hospital, you had a 95, 96% survival rate. And I think that will be markedly different in a LSCO conflict.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Drs. Eastridge and Hight, for those valuable insights and a sobering thought to end on. But thanks again for joining us today on Frontline Surgery. We'll stay tuned for the next episode, and until then, stay ready.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Frontline Surgery. We hope today's discussion has provided valuable insights into military trauma care.
Be sure to join us next time for more expert perspectives and battlefield-ready knowledge. Until then, stay ready.